Welcome to the Envision IT Extranet User Manager for Sharepoint Hydra login demonstration. What we're going to talk about today is do a quick introduction, and then we're going to take an overview of the different types of extranet users that would be coming into your system. And we're going to show you what the process will look like and actually demonstrate the login experience for each of those types of users. Just a quick background overview first before we dive in. The Extranet User Manager is a Sharepoint add-on that simplifies the creation and management of extranet user accounts. It also improves on the user experience for the extranet users, giving them an enhanced login experience. Underneath this is a Hydra login, which consists of a login page and a set of providers that allows a broad set of users to log into Sharepoint. Let's start with an overview of the four categories of users that we have coming into our extranet implementation. First, on the left, we have our internal users. These are people that work for your organization, are typically inside of your corporate Active Directory. Next, we have what we call our managed AD users. These are people outside of your organization who you manage accounts for, and you keep them also in an Active Directory. Alternatively, we have a similar set of users we call our managed SQL users, again managed by your organization, people that belong outside of your organization, but instead their credentials are actually stored in a SQL Server database. And the last category we have is federated users. These are users that are actually managed by the organization that they belong to, which is outside of yours, and there's a trusted federation between the two organizations. Let's talk about the infrastructure required to support our extranet. In the center of our diagram here, we have our actual Sharepoint farm. This lives inside of our DMZ, with firewalls protecting it from the internet to the right, and also protecting our corporate internal network to the left. Down below we have our DMZ Active Directory, which acts as a repository for our managed AD users. We also have a SQL Server database, which acts as a repository for our managed SQL users. On the left-hand side, we have our internal corporate AD, which is where all of our staff credentials are residing. And on the right, we have a federated AD that belongs to one of our partner organizations that we're going to do a federated trust with. Let's talk first about the experience from an internal user accessing the Sharepoint site. In a normal Sharepoint environment, what happens when they access the Sharepoint farm is their credentials get passed to the internal DMZ Active Directory, and through a one-way trust, that gets passed up into our internal AD. One of the advantages of using the Envision IT Extranet User Manager Hydra login is we can actually simplify that process so that when our internal users access Sharepoint, Sharepoint understands they're coming from inside our network, and it actually passes those credentials directly through to our internal Active Directory. Let's have a look at what that login experience looks like now. Here's a simple Sharepoint team site that we've created for demonstration purposes. The top level site is anonymously available, so I don't actually need to sign in to be able to see the site. If I do want to provide credentials though, I can click the sign in link here. And because I'm actually inside of the corporate network, the Hydra login understands that, takes the Windows credentials that I've logged into my system with, and without any further prompts to me, authenticates me into the site, and I'm good to go from there. Let's take the example now that one of our internal staff members is actually working outside of the office, either from home or from a remote location. They're no longer inside of our corporate network, so when they access the Sharepoint site, though, they still want the same experience of using their internal corporate AD credentials. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So I'm here at the same Sharepoint site, same URL, except I'm accessing it from outside of our network. Now when I click on the sign-in link, I'm prompted to provide my credentials. I enter my domain/username and my same credentials that I would use to log on to my Windows computer if I was inside of the office. Hit the login link, accept the disclaimer, and I can now enter the site. And I'm logged into the site with the exact same credentials as I was in the previous example. Let's take a slightly different look at the previous example. I'm back again anonymously at my site. When I click on my sign-in link, instead of providing my internal username and password, what I actually want to do is sign in using my email. We can see that that's actually what we're asking for on the page here. So if I type in my internal user at envisionit.com email alias, and I provide the exact same AD password that I used in the previous example, what we're going to do is we're actually going to pick up the fact that this email address is envision.com, which we know is an internal corporate user. We're going to actually look up inside of our corporate AD for a user account with that email address associated with it. We're going to use that account to authenticate in. So when I click on my login link here, I get the exact same experience, and I'm actually logged in as the same user. It's just I provided an email and password instead of a username and password. Let's take the example now that we've got one of our managed AD users that are coming into the site from outside of our network. They're going to hit the Sharepoint site through our external firewall, and it's going to authenticate them against the DMZ Active Directory where their credentials are stored. So here we are back on our external site again. When I click on the sign-in link, I actually want to log in as one of our managed AD users that are in our DMZ Active Directory. So what I'm going to use is actually the email address for that user, manageduser@hotmail.com, and the password for that account. And very similar to our previous example, what we're going to do is look up in the DMZ Active Directory for a user that has that email address and use their credentials to log into the site through there. I again accept the disclaimer, enter the site, and I'm now logged in as the managed AD user. The nice thing here is, while we can't use the email address as the username in Active Directory, we basically obfuscate that to the end user. So they see themselves logging in with their email address and their password, which is easy for them to remember. And under the hood, we actually translate that into their Active Directory username that they never actually see in the site. Our next example is very similar. Also a managed user. We're going to look at the managed SQL users on our right-hand side here. Once again, they're going to be hitting the Sharepoint site from outside of our external firewall, but instead of going to the DMZ Active Directory, they're actually going to authenticate into the SQL server. So there's actually an ASP.NET DB database that we've got on that SQL box that stores their encrypted username and password information. So here we've come to a slightly different URL. What we've done is we've actually extended our web application into another zone and put a SQL provider on instead of the Active Directory provider. The user experience is exactly the same for the end user. They see the same login form. They provide a similar email address and password. So in this case, we're going to use managed SQL user at hotmail.com as our account and provide our credentials again and go ahead and hit the login link. Now, some of the slight differences you're going to notice here on this extension, we've actually turned off the disclaimer. So we have the option of either having that disclaimer page come up or not. In this case, we've chosen not to. The other change that we've done here is we've actually left the default Sharepoint behavior for the user profile through here. So what it's doing is it's actually taking the provider name, which was the managed SQL, and then the email address that we've entered as the username in and displaying that as the user here. What we did in our previous examples is we actually have an additional feature in the Hydra login that allows you to map the profile information into the Sharepoint display name. So rather than having to set up the user profile import service with your various different providers and the delays associated with doing that, we can actually have that update happen right at the moment of login and have your welcome menu display the appropriate name right in there. Now, one of the main reasons in the past for using SQL as your authentication store was that you could actually use the email address as the username in SQL. It's less of an issue now with the Hydra provider that we're able to mask that and provide that same user experience on the Active Directory side. But the other advantage of using SQL over Active Directory is if you don't already have a domain set up in your DMZ, the overhead of setting up a couple of additional domain controllers and creating a new domain is a somewhat onerous task. Setting up an additional database on an existing SQL server is quite straightforward and easy to do. So some of our implementations go the Active Directory route if they can leverage an existing DMZ AD. Others go the SQL route. So our last example here is probably the most complex. This is where you have a group of federated users that work for an organization outside of yours, and you want them to actually use their credentials that are managed by their organization on your Sharepoint site. So when they're coming in and hitting your Sharepoint farm, what you need to actually do is pass the authentication back to their ADFS services that are inside of their network. They enter their credentials there, and then a claim is generated and passed back to Sharepoint on our side so that the login process can complete from there. So now when we click on the sign-in link here, what we're going to do is actually enter an email address for somebody who's outside of our organization, but belongs to an organization that we have a trusted relationship with. So let's go ahead and enter in ADFS1 user at starfleet.gov. And what happens here is when we tab off of this field, we're going to recognize that this email alias is a federated organization with us. So what we actually do is we disable the password and we remove the login link, and we actually provide an additional link here saying that you have to log in at the Federation Gateway 1 in order to provide your credentials. So what happens when I click on that link is I'm actually leaving our Sharepoint site and I'm going to an ADFS login page that's provided by the member organization that we're federated with. And I actually use my credentials, ADFS1 user, and my password here that belong to that other organization. So these Active Directory accounts are actually created and managed, and the passwords are managed through that other organization. When I hit sign in from here, what it does is it creates a claims token and passes that back to SharePoint, and SharePoint understands that I come from that trusted organization, and I then have the appropriate permissions into the site from here. And in fact, if I was inside of the network at that trusted organization, we can actually have a single sign-on experience, much like we showed at the beginning of the session, where I don't need to enter my credentials. It actually uses my Windows credentials from my member organization, automatically federates with that, and passes that claim back to SharePoint and logs me into the site. So I have a seamless single sign-on experience where those credentials are actually managed by the partner organization. So there you have an overview of the Envision IT Extranet User Manager Hydra login. We provide a single user experience across all categories of users. For internal and ADFS users, there's a single sign-on experience possible, and all users are able to log in with their email address, regardless of whether they're SQL FBA users or managed AD users.